And welcome back. This being May the 4th be with you. Okay, so we're wrapping up here on chapter 16, dealing with bioengineering. We've talked about so many things. We've talked about the difference between bioengineering and biomedical engineering. We've talked about so many like basic biology things, dealing with genetics and things like that. Here, we're looking at bioengineering applications. Okay, and with that, yeah, for bioengineering applications, of course, they're relying on 5 primary areas of biology, which, if you're kind of wondering, it's kind of like way, way back here, like these basic 5 areas of biology here on slide number 15. Okay, so with that, of course, there's other fields of engineering involved. There's a lot of biotechnology. There's biological engineering, biomedical engineering, and agricultural engineering. So biological engineering, of course, there's been a dramatic impact on society and environment, where you're focusing on living materials and waste. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if we're looking at biological engineering, there's a couple of things we got to look at. We got to look at genetic engineering and we got to look at biomass. Okay. In genetic engineering, man has been doing that for a long, long time. There was a natural process and then the unnatural process. Okay. So when we look at agriculture, it's a question of altering the properties of plant. It's not like I've got corn and now I'm changing it to a strawberry. That's not it at all. This is a question of changing things when you're altering the genes of things like corn, where you could change the taste. You could look at how fast does it grow? Does it need as much water? Is it resistant to insects? Is it resistant to disease? Those are the things that you look at when you're talking about genetic engineering for things like plants. Transgenesis, cisgenesis. Essentially, if you break it down, transgenesis, you're making a major change. Cisgenesis, it's more like a small change in comparison. I'm not too worried about those terms. Biomass. If we look at what biomass is, you could look at wood, food, and yard waste. Okay, and we do generate a lot of food waste, yard waste. Think like lawnmower clippings. Okay, when the gardener comes in and they trim the bushes, all that would be an example of yard waste. Now, we are improving on biomass generation. Okay, that's good. Mixed environmental impact. Typically, when you touch one thing in the environment, it has an effect somewhere else. Okay, so there have been good sides and bad sides to this. I'm not going to worry about it too much. Now, we got to talk about bioconversion. Okay, bioconversion, we're changing something. We're changing living material from one thing into another. Okay, so we talk about biochemical conversion, which is a pretty common thing. It's also can be a natural process, and there's thermochemical conversion. So when we look at biochemical conversion, we can look at microorganisms. It could be bacteria, it could be fungi, okay, like yeast, for example, where they can change the biomass into some kind of an energy source. Okay, and that would be a pretty useful thing for humanity to do that. And really, it's not, you're letting nature do the work, hard work for you. Okay, now there's 3 ways to look at that. You've got fermentation creates alcohol, anaerobic digestion produces methane, and composting converts waste into compost. Okay, what are all these involved in? Well, let's fermentation is a process, okay, where there is typically you can use yeast for that, where it will create alcohol. It changes sugar into alcohol, okay? And there's different kinds of alcohol out there, and we've used that as an energy source, which is kind of cool. All right. Now there's anaerobic digestion that produces methane. Well, yeah, we kind of do some of that ourselves. Anaerobic. Aerobic meaning you need oxygen and meaning not. So when we look at anaerobic digestion, producing methane, it really means you make CH3, okay, and you don't need oxygen in order to do that. Okay. Now, there's another one called composting. Composting, you can convert waste into compost. Okay. So when we look at fermentation, it could be different things like mash or liquid containing glucose, fructose, or sucrose. Bottom line is in fermentation, you need some kind of a sugar. Most people think about sugar as the table sugar, that's sucrose. And that's actually a disaccharide because you have a glucose and a fructose connected together. Okay? Whereas fructose and glucose are actually smaller forms of sugar. They do taste sweet, but not quite the same as table sugar. Okay? So the idea is that when the yeast goes and reacts with the sugar, it helps break it down. And part of that is dealing with making carbon dioxide as a byproduct. It's like a waste product, if you will. And the CO2 gets released. And then what happens is it ends up changing into alcohol. Now, fermentation, arguably another thing, if you're making bread dough rise, what are you using to make bread dough rise? Yeast. Now, yeast is a fungus, if you didn't know that. It doesn't really have a good smell to it. It's like, ew, but it works, okay? So when you're looking at the slice of bread and you see all those little holes in there, those holes were made by bubbles of carbon dioxide that the yeast produced in that fermentation process in order to, and that carbon dioxide was trying to escape. But while some of the carbon dioxide escaped, not all of it. So that's why you got all those air bubbles inside your slice of bread. Now, if you didn't have that process, you would have flat bread or unleavened bread. Anaerobic design. Again, microorganisms break down biomass, including food waste, yard waste, and animal and human waste. Okay? The methane is produced and the tank limits exposure to the oxygen. Right, exactly. So again, this is a natural process, and we can take advantage of these natural processes in order to produce what we need. Now, I want to point out, this anaerobic digestion also applies to underground trash heaps that generate methane gas that comes out of the ground, too. Oh boy, does it. And the thing is that when the methane gas is coming out of the ground, in the past, some guy walks down the street, doesn't know there was a garbage dump there, a landfill, years before, lights a match to light his cigarette, and you have an explosion. That has happened, and that's one of the reasons why now they stick a pipe in the ground, okay, to release the methane, and then they burn it off, okay? As that methane is coming out of the ground, it's burning off. And that's a safe way. It's like a release valve, if you will. Composting. Some of you guys may possibly have tried that in your backyard. A completely natural process. You can't just compost anything. There are certain things you have to do. Okay. Compost heaps. This is one where you use a rack in there. You can use food waste, yard waste, animal and human waste. I wouldn't do human waste if you're doing this in the backyard. Disease, things like that. Okay. But the idea is that the bacteria will naturally break this down. Okay. And inside the compost heap, if you were to stick a thermometer, chances are you probably got a higher temperature because the warm air will rise. But it does break down that waste in the compost that you can go and use that on soil. And it's a natural fertilizer. Win-win. Okay. Thermochemical conversion. Well, when you're thinking thermo, you should be thinking heat automatically. So heat creates chemical change in biological materials. Okay. So that's what's happening. You've got chemical change, but of course you need heat in there too. Now there's three ways to do this. There's combustion and pyrolysis. In combustion, you should be thinking fire. Okay, that would be an example of combustion. It's an exothermic reaction, so heat's being released, okay, in which the substance is burned in the presence of air or oxygen only. So that's one example of a thermochemical conversion. Pyrolysis, on the other hand, is a thermal decomposition of materials at elevated temperatures in an inert atmosphere. Okay, inert means it's not reacting. So let's say you had an atmosphere that was filled with argon gas, which it doesn't react, but you're slowly, here's your stuff you want to break down, but you kind of heat it up. But it's not going to catch on fire. It's not going to combust because the atmosphere won't allow it. So, in that process, you're getting chemical changes in the biological materials because heat, when you add it in there, it's getting some chemical changes happening. Bonds are broken, new bonds are being formed. There's changes that are happening. Okay? Gasification, that's a process that converts organic or fossil fuel based carbonaceous materials into carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide. Wow. Wow, 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 wow. What are you talking about here? Look, when we talk about organic or fossil fuel based carbonaceous materials, carbonaceous means that it's like the main thing. It is the main part. And if you think about organic things, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen are your big three pieces that are there. Okay, as far as organic. All right. So fossil fuel based, you could look at oil, you could look at gasoline, diesel, okay, things like that. We can change that gasification to carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide, and we can react these materials at high temperatures, no combustion. And there's a little bit of oxygen in there and or steam in there. So, for example, what they would do in World War II in France, because my dad saw these when he was a kid. Okay, they had cars. Very few people had the cars that had the ability to take wood and be able to do this gasification process in order to have the engine work. I don't know all the details about the car, but that's what some of them did. They literally put in wood and then they would be able to do this gasification process and get the car to work. Necessity is the mother of invention, if you stop and think about it. All right, agricultural engineering. Again, we are using those bioconversion principles we just talked about. Okay, so we do look at principles from other engineering fields as well. And so, what's the point for agricultural engineers? Well, improving crop production, able to produce more food to feed people, improving animal production, okay, improving the processing of food products. Okay, so when we look at genetically engineered crops, we can talk about crops that are resistant to things like herbicides. Those are chemicals that are used to go and kill plants, insect pests, diseases, increasing the crop yield. In other words, where you normally have 6 tomatoes on the plant, maybe you've got now 8. Okay, surviving extreme environmental conditions, maybe the idea of making do with less water, making that it's more heat resistant. So those are things that would allow them to grow those crops in other areas, whereas normally they couldn't do it. Okay. Improved nutritional value. Okay. Longer shelf life, better flavor or texture. Okay. Years ago in the 90s, there was something called golden rice. And it was hailed as a big, awesome thing because it was a question of feeding the world's hungry. And they were able to produce, they genetically engineered it where they produced more rice and then more people were fed. There was the controversy, though, with some of those crops that were growing faster. okay, that they were not as nutritionally valuable. In other words, they were lacking the nutritional value compared to the regularly grown crops. Remember earlier in the year, we talked about trade offs. And there you go. What can I say? There's always a trade off in things. How are you going to make that decision? Just like when you guys did with the business, right? Tools, machine gun. Um, you're injecting cells with genetic information in there. Typically, it is injected in a petri dish of cells. It's designed in the 1980s for use with plant cells, but now it's used on all kinds of cells. It's been a boon. It's been a benefit to mankind that we can go and do this, and that has allowed genetic engineering to proceed forward. Okay, animal production, engineered animal medicines like vaccines, synthetic hormones. Ooh, that's a beautiful example here. There are people out there who their thyroid gland does not put out enough thyroid stimulating hormone, okay, for your body to produce the thyroid that you need. Okay, so people. We're back. Okay. Uh, so, talking about the thyroid hormone, believe it or not, when we talk about engineered animal medicines, here's a great example of this. Um, my mom had problems with her thyroid as a kid. And then what happened was when the doctor gave her medication, it went from it went and did the other extreme. I think it was a question of my mom wasn't producing enough thyroid. She had goiter. Okay. And then as a kid, and then they gave her medicine and it took care of the goiter, but it screwed up the thyroid gland for the rest of her life that she had to take synthetic thyroid hormones. Now, here's the thing synthetic hormones. Well, wait, what are you talking about? Today, companies that manufacture the synthetic thyroid, they get that from the urine of horses. I repeat, the engineers today, they are getting the synthetic thyroid. They distill that, they get that from the urine of horses. Chemically, it's the same in terms of the molecule itself. Selective breeding is another example. Okay, if you are breeding, and if you think about dogs, look at the different kinds of dogs you have out there. Okay, they're selected for different certain traits that they are emphasizing. Okay, where some dogs they're meant more to be in the cold north compared to those animals who are not meant to be in the cold north. If you look at the Chihuahua compared to the Husky dog, obviously these two dogs need to be normally in totally different areas. Okay, the Chihuahua is not going to last very long up in Alaska in the wintertime. The Husky has a better chance to survive in the wintertime in Alaska because it's got a lot more fur. Okay, if you go down into the Mexican desert, okay, in the middle of the summer, guess what? The Chihuahua has a much better chance of survival because it doesn't have a lot of hair and it's small, okay, whereas the Husky, with all that fur on it, it's going to be, and it's going to not make it, okay? So, genetically modified animals, we can talk about cloning, okay? We can do that as well. We have done it where we've been able to clone some animals after multiple attempts, and this gets into some of the other issues out there with that. Okay, and with that, food products processing. Raw products prepared for human consumption. Things like sorting, cleaning, preparing, packaging, shipping. You go to Costco and you got those apples that are in the plastic container thing, okay, that they sell it. Um, the wax covering that you find on the apples, it helps preserve the apples a little bit longer, okay. It's part of the processing. Um, the packaging, the shipping, it's so important how they do that. Especially, if you think about it, where are the bananas we eat here in Southern California? Where do you think they come from? Central or South America. So that's a couple of thousand miles away at least, just off the top of my head. Okay. So there's got to be ways that we can protect them while they're shipping. So this is all part of food products processing. Biomedical engineering, we can talk about using support systems to identify diseases and physical mechanisms to help people. Biological engineering with human beings and medical technology. I'm going to stop here with this. So, with this, we talked about food processing, we've talked about animal production, we've talked about gene guns, crop production. What is agricultural engineering? We've talked about thermochemical conversion, where we looked at gasification, we looked at combustion and pyrolysis. We looked at composting, taking biomass and converting it, anaerobic digestion, fermentation, okay, where we use microorganisms. We have others do the work for us. It's great. We talked about what is biomass. Excuse me. Wood, food, yard waste, okay? Like I said, we talked about genetic engineering. We talked a little bit about how we can change properties of crops and even animals to an extent. Okay, we talked about biological engineering. We've looked at the bioengineering applications. We're not quite done. We got to work with biomedical engineering. And with that, I'm going to stop here.